The Council of Mockery, the crystalline walls of Station Nexus Prime, caught the light from 17 different suns, casting rainbow patterns across the vast assembly hall, where representatives from 43 species had gathered. Ambassador Sarah Chun stood at the central podium, her hands steady despite the weight of what she carried. Today, humanity would present its cultural archives to the Galactic Council for the first time since joining the interstellar community 3 years ago. The holographic display above her head shimmered to life, showing images from Earth's vast collection of myths, legends, and folklore. Dragons soared across digital skies, their scales gleaming with ancient fire. Heroes wielded impossible weapons against creatures that defied physics. Gods walked among mortals, shaping reality with their will. Honored delegates, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the chamber through universal translators. What you see here represents thousands of years of human storytelling. These tales have shaped our culture, our values, and our understanding of courage in the face of the unknown. A ripple of what could only be described as amusement passed through the assembled aliens. The Zeltharians, with their multiple eyes, arranged in geometric patterns across their elongated skulls, blinked in sequence as if sharing a private joke. The insectoid Vrak clicked their mandibles in rhythm, a sound their species made when encountering something absurd. High Counselor Vex-High of the Zeltharian Empire leaned forward in his floating chair, his voice dripping with condescension. Ambassador Chun, surely you don't expect this council to take these fantasies seriously? Dragons that breathe fire, humans who can lift mountains, invisible spirits that control the elements? The chamber erupted in what passed for laughter. Among the various species, the aquatic Murloth made bubbling sounds through their breathing apparatus, while the silicon-based Kristans resonated at frequencies that made the air itself seem to chuckle. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she maintained her diplomatic composure. These stories served as more than entertainment, Counselor. They preserved knowledge, taught moral lessons, and preserved knowledge? Interrupted Commander Zix of the Vrak Swarm, her antennae twitching with amusement. Knowledge of what? How to fight imaginary beasts. How to speak with creatures that don't exist. From the back of the chamber, a figure in a dark military uniform observed the proceedings in silence. Colonel Marcus Stone had been attending these sessions for weeks, never speaking, never reacting to the constant mockery directed at his species. His weathered face bore the scars of battles fought in places the Council preferred not to think about, and his eyes held depths that suggested he had seen things others could not imagine. The ridicule continued as more delegates joined in. Perhaps humans could teach us about their magic, suggested a floating Etherian, its gaseous form shimmering with what might have been mirth. We could replace our quantum computers with crystal balls, or abandon our plasma weapons for enchanted swords, added another voice from the crowd. Sarah's presentation continued despite the interruptions, showing images of heroes facing impossible odds, of ordinary people discovering extraordinary strength when all seemed lost, of ancient wisdom, preserved in the form of stories that seemed too fantastic to be true. With each new myth displayed, the mockery grew louder. The legend of Perseus and Medusa teaches us about facing our fears by seeing them clearly, Sarah explained, showing the image of a hero using a mirror to defeat a monster whose gaze turned living beings to stone. The story of David and Goliath demonstrates that courage and ingenuity can overcome seemingly insurmountable power. High Counselor Vex-High made a dismissive gesture with one of his forearms. These are children's stories, Ambassador. Fairy tales to help primitive minds cope with a universe they couldn't understand. We deal in facts, in proven science, in measurable reality. The Kristans began to resonate at a lower frequency, their version of agreement. Our databases contain the actual history of galactic civilization, announced their representative, a towering figure of living diamond. Real achievements, documented progress, scientific advancement. What need do we have for human fantasies? As the session drew to a close, it became clear that the Council would reject humanity's cultural contributions. The official vote was a formality. 38 species voted to classify human mythology as primitive fiction unsuitable for galactic cultural archives. With only 4 abstentions and 1 absent member, Sarah gathered her materials with as much dignity as she could muster. But before she could leave the podium, alarms began blaring throughout the station. The lights shifted to emergency amber, and the chamber's central display switched from cultural archives to tactical readings. Alert! Announced the station's AI in 17 languages simultaneously. Unknown energy signatures detected at grid reference Omega-7. Multiple contacts, classification ... unknown. Recommend immediate defensive posture. The chamber fell silent as the tactical display showed dozens of massive objects approaching from the edge of known space. They moved without any recognizable propulsion, their shapes defying easy categorization. Some appeared serpentine, others winged. Still others seemed to shift between forms as they traveled. Defense Commander Tissara of the Murloth took immediate control of the situation. All civilian vessels are to maintain position. Military ships assume defensive formation around Nexus Prime, prepare to intercept unknown contacts. But as the objects drew closer, something strange began happening to the station's sensors. The readings flickered and changed, showing impossible things. Ships that seemed to be made of flame. Creatures that registered as both solid matter and pure energy. Beings that appeared to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Sensor malfunction, reported a technician, his tentacles dancing across his control board. The readings they're not making sense. Colonel Stone finally stood from his seat in the back of the chamber. His movement was slow, deliberate, and somehow commanded attention despite the chaos around him. He walked down the aisle between the delegates' seats, his boots echoing in the suddenly quiet space. "They're not malfunctioning," he said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber without amplification. "Your sensors are working perfectly. They're just showing you something you weren't prepared to see." High Counselor Vex-High turned his multiple eyes toward the human colonel. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Stone reached the central podium and looked up at the tactical display. The approaching objects had begun to take more defined shapes now, and those shapes were becoming disturbingly familiar, too. Anyone who had been paying attention to the human cultural presentation. "You laughed at our dragons," Stone said quietly, pointing to a massive serpentine form that seemed to burn with its own inner fire. "You mocked our spirits and demons." He indicated several beings that appeared to phase in and out of visible reality. "You dismissed our heroes and monsters as primitive superstition." The chamber was completely silent, now, except for the continuing alarms. Even the emergency lighting seemed to dim, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Stone turned to face the assembled delegates, and for the first time in 3 years of council sessions, he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "What if I told you," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber, "that our myths weren't stories at all? What if they were memories? Warnings passed down from the time when humanity shared the universe with beings that your science says can't exist?" The tactical display continued to update as the approaching entities drew closer to Nexus Prime. Their formations were clearly organized, clearly intelligent, and clearly hostile. Energy readings spiked as weapons that operated on principles unknown to galactic science began charging. "Impossible," whispered Commander Zix, her antennae trembling. "Our surveys of human space found no evidence of advanced alien contact. Your species developed in isolation." Stone's smile widened, and there was something ancient and knowing in his eyes. That's because you were looking for the wrong kind of evidence. You searched for technology, for infrastructure, for the kinds of traces that civilizations like yours leave behind. But these beings, they don't build cities or fly ships in the way you understand. They are the cities. They are the ships. They are forces of nature given consciousness and will. The first wave of entities reached the outer defense grid, and what happened next defied every law of physics the Galactic Council thought they understood. The energy beings passed through the defensive barriers as if they weren't there. The massive serpentine creatures coiled around ships that fired their most powerful weapons without effect. Winged beings that seemed to be made of living starlight descended toward the station itself, and their very presence began affecting the quantum fields that held Nexus Prime together. In the distance, humanity's small fleet of ships hung motionless, making no move to flee or fight. They simply waited, as if their crews had been expecting this moment all along. Colonel Stone watched the chaos beginning to unfold around the station and slowly began removing his dress uniform jacket. Underneath, he wore a simple black shirt marked with symbols that several delegates now recognized from the human cultural presentation. Ancient symbols that had decorated the weapons and armor of humanity's legendary heroes. The question now, Stone said as the lights flickered and the station shook under the influence of forces beyond conventional understanding, is whether you're ready to learn why humanity never forgot these stories, and whether you're prepared to discover what it really means when legends walk among the stars. The tactical display showed more entities emerging from deep space, their numbers growing by the moment. And in the ambassadors section, Sarah Chun quietly activated a communications device that had been waiting unused in her diplomatic kit for 3 years. "This is Ambassador Chun to Human Fleet Command," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Code Prometheus is now active. Repeat, Code Prometheus is active. It's time to come home. When myths walk among stars, the first creature to fully manifest near Station Nexus Prime was beautiful in the way that natural disasters are beautiful. It resembled a dragon from human mythology, so perfectly that several delegates gasped in recognition. But it was larger than any story had ever described. Its scales caught and reflected the light of distant suns, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change as if the creature existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When it opened its mouth, no fire emerged. Instead, space itself began to bend and warp around its jaws, creating gravitational anomalies that pulled smaller debris into impossible spirals. The station's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, sending delegates tumbling from their seats. "All defense platforms open." "Fire," commanded Defense Commander Tessara, but her order came too late. The creature had already demonstrated that conventional weapons were useless against it. Plasma bolts and quantum torpedoes passed through its form without causing any apparent damage, as if it existed just slightly out of phase with normal reality. More entities continued to arrive, each one matching descriptions from human mythology with disturbing accuracy. Beings of pure energy that crackled with lightning moved alongside towering figures that seemed to be carved from living stone. Winged creatures that appeared to be made of condensed starlight danced around serpents, whose scales reflected not light, but time itself, creating temporal distortions that made them appear to be moving in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. High Counselor Veshai's multiple eyes tracked the approaching beings with mounting terror. "This is impossible," he whispered, his usually commanding voice reduced to a barely audible croak. "Our science, our understanding of physics, none of this should be possible." Colonel Stone had finished removing his dress uniform and now stood in combat gear that looked like it belonged in a museum or a legend. His armor bore engravings that seemed to shift in the changing light, and the weapon at his side was clearly not standard military issue. It looked old, ancient even, but it hummed with an energy that made the air around it shimmer. "Your science is limited by your assumptions," Stone said, his voice carrying easily through the chaos. "You believe the universe operates according to laws you've discovered, but you've barely scratched the surface of what's really out there." The station shook again as one of the massive entities, this one resembling a kraken from human, ocean myths wrapped tentacles around the outer hull. Where it touched, the metal began to change, becoming something organic and alive. Emergency klaxons wailed as life support systems struggled to compensate for sections of the station that were no longer entirely technological. "How do we fight?" "Them?" demanded Commander Zix, her usual arrogance replaced by desperate fear. "Our weapons are useless." Stone turned to look at her, and his expression was almost pitying. "You can't fight them with weapons. You can't defeat them with technology. These beings exist on a level of reality that your science refuses to acknowledge." Sarah Chun had moved to stand beside Stone, and she was no longer the diplomatic ambassador who had been presenting to the council minutes ago. She wore similar ancient-style armor, and her eyes held the same knowing depth that Stone's did. In her hands, she carried what appeared to be a simple staff, but it pulsed with the same strange energy as Stone's weapon. "Then how?" pleaded the Kristen representative, his diamond form flickering with internal stress patterns. "How do we survive this?" Stone and Chun exchanged a look that held centuries of shared knowledge. "By remembering what your species chose to forget," Stone said. "By accepting that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than your computers can calculate." The colonel walked to the chamber's central control console and began entering commands with surprising familiarity. The station's main display shifted from tactical readings to something that looked like a star chart, but the patterns were wrong. Instead of showing the positions of celestial bodies, it displayed flows of energy that connected every part of the galaxy in a vast, living web. "This is the real map of our universe," Stone explained, as delegates stared in wonder at the flowing patterns. Not the cold distances between dead rocks, but the living connections between all things. Every myth, every legend, every story that your species dismissed as primitive, they were all attempts to describe this reality. The entities outside the station seemed to sense the change in the display. Their attacks on the structure slowed, and several of the larger beings moved closer to the main viewports, as if they were curious about what the small creatures inside were doing. Stone continued working at the console, and gradually the energy patterns on the display began to shift and align. "Human myths weren't just stories," he said as he worked. "They were instruction manuals. They taught us how to interact with forces that exist beyond the physical realm, how to speak with beings that your science says are impossible." A new sound began to resonate through the station, not the harsh klaxons of emergency alerts, but something that sounded almost like music. It was a harmonic frequency that seemed to vibrate in dimensions the delegates didn't know existed. And as it grew stronger, the attacks on the station stopped entirely. The dragon-like entity that had first appeared now floated peacefully outside the main viewport, its massive form no longer distorting space around it. Other creatures took positions around the station, but their postures had changed from aggressive to ... waiting. "They're not here to destroy us," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder despite her apparent familiarity with what was happening. "They're here because something called them, something that threatens the balance they've spent eons maintaining." The harmonic resonance reached a crescendo, and suddenly the delegates could understand something that had been impossible moments before. The entities outside weren't just mindless forces of destruction. They were ancient guardians, beings of such age and power that they had become woven into the fundamental structure of reality itself. And they were afraid. The fear wasn't for themselves, but for something else that was coming. Something that even these legendary beings, these living myths, couldn't face alone. Through the harmonic connection, images began to flow into the minds of everyone in the chamber. Visions of darkness spreading between the stars, consuming entire systems, not by destroying them, but by making them forget they had ever existed. "The Void Seekers," Stone said, and his voice carried a weight of dread that made several delegates shiver. "The enemy that humanity has been preparing to face for centuries. The reason our ancestors encoded warnings in every story, every myth, every legend they could create. The tactical display updated with new information, showing a massive distortion approaching from the galactic rim. It wasn't moving like a fleet or a natural phenomenon. It was moving like an infection, spreading from star to star, leaving empty space behind where thriving systems had once existed." High Counselor Vex High found his voice, though it trembled with fear. "How long have you known? How long has humanity been aware of this threat?" Stone's expression was grim. "Since before we learned to write. Our species has been carrying the memory of the last time the Void Seekers came through this part of the galaxy. Every culture, every civilization on Earth developed myths about the end of the world, about darkness consuming everything, about heroes who would rise to face impossible odds when the final battle came. The entities outside the station began to move in complex patterns, taking positions that resembled the formations described in human military legends. The dragon creature positioned itself at what military tacticians would recognize as the point position of a spear formation. The energy beings spread out in supporting roles, while the massive stone-like entities formed a defensive wall. They're not just myths," Sarah added, watching the legendary beings take their battle positions. "They're our allies. Humanity made a pact with them long ago, in a time before recorded history. We would preserve the memory of their existence, keep their stories alive, and when the great darkness returned, we would call them back to fight beside us." The station shook again, but this time it wasn't from attack. The ancient beings were sharing their power, strengthening Nexus Prime's defenses in ways that conventional engineering never could. The walls became harder than diamond, the life support systems began operating with impossible efficiency, and every weapon on the station started humming with energies that made their designers' original specifications look like toys. Commander Zix looked at her tactical displays in amazement. "Our weapons? They're showing power levels that should be impossible." Stone nodded. "Your technology is being enhanced by forces that exist beyond the physical realm. Your plasma becomes living fire. Your shields become barriers of pure will. Your sensors can now detect things that exist in the spaces between thoughts." The approaching Void Seeker formation had been detected by the enhanced sensors, and what they revealed made the assembled delegates understand the true scope of the threat they faced. This wasn't an invasion in any conventional sense. It was an attempt to erase reality itself, to reduce the complex, living universe to simple, empty darkness. But as the legendary beings took their positions around Nexus Prime, and as human ships began arriving from across the galaxy, ships that moved in ways that defied physics and carried weapons that fired concepts rather than energy, the delegates began to understand something else. They were witnessing the return of the Age of Heroes. The battle for the existence of consciousness itself was about to begin, and humanity had spent 50,000 years preparing for this moment. Every story they had ever told, every myth they had ever preserved, every legend they had ever shared was about to be tested in the crucible of cosmic war. High Counselor Vex High looked at Colonel Stone with new respect, and perhaps a touch of shame. "What do you need from us?" Stone's smile was fierce and proud. "Learn fast, fight hard, and remember that the universe is far more wonderful than you ever imagined. Because after today, nothing will ever be the same. The first Void-Seeker ships appeared at the edge of the system, and reality itself held its breath as myths and legends, prepared to prove that some stories are too important to remain fiction. In the distance, the dragon roared not with sound, but with pure defiance that echoed across dimensions. The final battle had begun, and humanity's greatest story was about to be written in the stars themselves. Asterisk.